long before his name became synonymous with legendary warriors and invincible strength, long before poets would craft epics around his fury and his sorrow that would inspire humanity for millennia to come, before mothers would whisper his story as both an aspiration and a cautionary tale to their children about the dangers of pride and divine favor. There was a moment of impossible choice that would shape an entire existence and define the very nature of what it meant to be a hero. It began not with Achilles himself, but with his mother, Thetis, a sea nymph of such breathtaking beauty and power that even the king of the gods, Zeus himself, had desired her with an intensity that shook the heavens. But Zeus, for all his authority and all his might, was forced to abandon his pursuit of Thetis when the fates revealed a prophecy so dire, so utterly catastrophic, that even the god of thunder dared not risk the consequences of defying it. Any child born to Thetis, the fates proclaimed in their ancient, immutable voices, would be greater than his father. For a god, this was not simply unacceptable, it was unthinkable. Zeus understood the pattern of the cosmos intimately, had lived through the cycle where sons overthrew fathers, where each generation of divine beings seized power from the previous one through violence and cunning. He had himself overthrown his father Kronos, had watched as his siblings engaged in bitter struggles for dominance. He had no desire, no intention of creating a being who might one day overthrow him, who might strip him of his throne and his power, and reduce him to irrelevance. And so Zeus, with typical divine pragmatism born from necessity rather than kindness, simply decided not to pursue Thetis further. Instead, he arranged for her to marry a mortal king, a man named Peleus, whose mortality meant that any children born to them would be technically mortal, even though their mother was divine. A half-mortal child could be talented, could be remarkable, but could never be greater than a god, because the mortal portion of their nature carried with it the limitations of humanity. It seemed like a perfect solution to an impossible problem. But Thetis did not wish to marry a mortal. She did not wish to leave the immortal realms, did not wish to bind herself to a creature whose lifespan was merely a blink compared to her own eternity. She viewed mortality as a punishment, as a degradation, as a fall from grace. She resisted Peleus with every power at her disposal, attempted to escape him through various transformations, becoming fire that burned without heat, becoming water that flowed without form, becoming a lion with teeth and claws that could rend the strongest armor. But Peleus, guided by the god Poseidon, who sympathized with the mortal king's desire, persisted through each transformation. He held on to Thetis through the fire and the water and the fearsome shapes she assumed, refusing to release her, refusing to accept rejection, until finally, exhausted and resigned, she submitted to the inevitable. The marriage produced a son, and the moment Thetis held this child, the moment she felt the potential burning within him like a star trapped in mortal flesh, the moment she recognized the extraordinary power flowing through his tiny body, she understood what absolutely had to be done. She could not accept that her son would be merely mortal, that he would age and weaken and eventually die like any ordinary human. She could not bear the thought of his glory fading, his strength diminishing, his light going out after only decades of life when he was clearly meant for something far greater. There had to be a way to preserve him, to make him eternal, to ensure that his greatness could never be diminished by the simple, inevitable passage of time. And so Thetis made a choice that would define her son's entire existence. She would make him immortal. Every night, while Peleus slept, while the castle was silent and the servants had retreated to their quarters, while the world seemed to hold its breath in the darkness, Thetis would take her infant son to the divine fire that burned in the great hearth of the palace. She would hold him over the flames with the careful precision of someone performing a sacred ritual, allowing the heat to burn away his mortal vulnerabilities. The fire would sear his skin, would consume the mortal weakness that flowed through him, but he would not die. Instead, with each night's exposure to the divine flames, with each careful immersion in the purifying fire, he would become more resistant to harm, more durable, more capable of withstanding what would destroy any ordinary being. The process continued night after night, week after week, month after month. With each exposure to the fire, with each ritual of transformation, Achilles grew stronger, more resistant to damage, more impossible to harm. His skin became harder, his bones denser. His entire physical form shifted towards something superhuman, something approaching the divine. But Peleus discovered what was happening. One night, waking from troubled sleep, he heard his son's cries coming from the great hall. He rushed down the stairs, moving through the darkness with the urgency of a father convinced that catastrophe was unfolding. He found his wife holding their infant over the divine flames, calmly and methodically subjecting their child to fire in the name of making him immortal. Peleus erupted in fury, not at the attempt itself, but at the violation of his son's autonomy, at Thetis's willingness to subject a child to such terrible ordeal without the father's knowledge or consent. He seized his son from Thetis's arms, pulling him away from the flames, his protective instinct overriding any understanding of what his wife was attempting to accomplish. And in that moment of interruption, in that single crucial instant, where Achilles was removed from the fire before the process could be completed, something absolutely essential was left undone. The ritual was broken, the transformation was interrupted, and some small part of Achilles' mortality remained, not fully burned away, not completely transformed into something divine. Thetis, knowing that Peleus would never allow her to continue the ritual, knowing that her plan had been irrevocably thwarted by her husband's intervention, made a final, desperate attempt to protect her son. She took him and carried him to a river. Not an ordinary river of the mortal world, but the river Styx itself, the most sacred and powerful river in all existence, the river whose waters granted absolute invulnerability to anything they touched. She held him by his heel, that small delicate ankle joint, the only part of his body that she gripped as she prepared for the dipping, the only place where her fingers made contact with his skin. And she dipped him completely into the Styx's divine current. The waters surrounded him, flowed over him, penetrated him with their sacred power, granted him protection that was nearly absolute, nearly perfect, nearly complete. When Thetis withdrew her son from the river, when she lifted him from the sacred waters and held him in her arms, she had created something unprecedented in the history of the cosmos. A being who was nearly invulnerable, whose skin could not be pierced by ordinary weapons, whose flesh could not be cut by mortal blades, whose strength and durability were beyond what any merely mortal being could achieve. But that one spot, that single heel where her hand had gripped him, where the waters had not touched, where the sacred protection had not reached, remained vulnerable. It remained mortal. It remained a flaw in an otherwise perfect armor of invulnerability. It remained, though neither Thetis nor her son understood it fully in that moment, a flaw that would one day matter more than all his strength combined. Thetis looked at her perfect, nearly invincible son and understood the bitter truth that the universe refused to permit. Perfection was impossible. Even in her careful planning, even in her desperate attempts to save her son from the normal limitations of mortality, she had created a being who possessed a weakness. One small, hidden weakness that would one day matter enormously. The child who would be called Achilles grew up knowing he was special, knowing he was different, knowing he possessed strength that exceeded what other children possessed by orders of magnitude. But he also grew up surrounded by careful restrictions, careful protections, and constant vigilance. His mother watched over him with an intensity that bordered on obsession, trying to protect him, trying to ensure that the one vulnerability she had created would never be discovered, never be exploited, never become the avenue through which harm could reach her beloved son. As a young man, Achilles was sent to study under Chiron, the legendary centaur who had trained many of Greece's greatest heroes, who possessed wisdom that spanned centuries, who understood combat and medicine and philosophy and the deep mysteries of the natural world. It was under Chiron's tutelage that Achilles truly began to understand the true extent of his abilities. He learned combat from the legendary centaur, learning sword techniques and spearwork and wrestling holds, and the thousand small strategies that separated merely skilled warriors from truly great ones. And he discovered something that both exhilarated and troubled him. His strength was almost without limit. No opponent could match him. No training partner could push him to his maximum capability because he seemed to have no maximum. Where other warriors had limits, clear points beyond which exhaustion or pain would force them to stop, definite moments where they had to acknowledge defeat and admit that they had met their match, Achilles seemed to have none. He could fight from dawn until dusk without tiring. He could sustain wounds that would kill other men and simply continue fighting as if nothing had happened. He could achieve feats of strength and speed that seemed to violate the laws of nature itself, seemed to make him something other than human, seemed to mark him as approaching the divine in his capabilities. And with this knowledge came something else, something insidious and seductive. The intoxicating certainty that he was meant for something far greater than ordinary life, that his destiny was written in legend rather than in the normal progression of days and years, that he was fundamentally different from and superior to everyone around him. Chiron taught him many things: combat technique and strategy, medicine and the properties of healing herbs, philosophy and the nature of justice, music and the arts that cultivate the soul. But the one thing the wise centaur could not teach him was humility. Because Achilles had never experienced failure, never experienced a true challenge that pushed him to his absolute limits, never encountered someone who could genuinely threaten him or make him question his own superiority. How could he develop humility when every aspect of his existence suggested that he was superior to those around him? How could he learn to doubt himself when his own experience consistently confirmed that he was better, stronger, faster, more capable than any peer he encountered? As Achilles entered young manhood, his reputation began to spread like wildfire across Greece. Stories of his strength and his invulnerability traveled from kingdom to kingdom, from warrior to warrior, growing with each telling until they seemed almost mythological in their scope. Kings and generals heard tales of a warrior who seemed impossible to harm, who moved with inhuman speed, who possessed strength that exceeded anything they had ever witnessed or even imagined. And then came the great crisis that would define his age and the entire generation of heroes. Helen of Sparta was abducted by Paris of Troy, and all of Greece mobilized for war. The call went out across the Greek kingdoms like a clarion bell ringing across the mountains. Every king, every prince, every warrior of note was expected to contribute forces to the massive expedition that would sail to Troy to retrieve Helen and restore Greek honor. It was the great unifying cause, the conflict that would bring together all the divided kingdoms of Greece under a single purpose, would create an alliance unprecedented in scale and scope. But Thetis knew something that others did not. Through prophecy granted to her by the fates, through divine knowledge that penetrated the veils of future time, Thetis had learned that if Achilles sailed to Troy, if he participated in the Trojan War, he would achieve the greatest glory that any warrior could possibly achieve. He would become the most legendary fighter in the entire conflict. His name would be remembered for thousands of years. His deeds would inspire stories and poems and works of art that would survive the fall of empires, that would outlive kingdoms and dynasties and entire civilizations. But there was a price, and it was the highest price that could possibly be demanded. If Achilles sailed to Troy, he would die there. He would not return home. He would not live out a long life surrounded by family and comfort and the pleasures of peace. He would achieve immortal glory, achieve a fame that would echo through eternity, but at the cost of his actual mortality, a trade-off where he would gain eternal fame and remembrance while losing the chance to live beyond the brief years of youth and strength, while sacrificing the possibility of a normal, extended lifespan. The alternative was simple and, in its own way, equally devastating. Achilles could remain in Greece. He could avoid the war entirely, could refuse the call and claim some legitimate excuse that would allow him to stay home. He could live a long life, comfortable and peaceful, could grow old, could marry, could have children, could build a legacy of family and security and accumulated wisdom. But no one would remember him. No one would sing his songs. No bard would craft epic poems around his name. He would live an ordinary life, however long and pleasant, and then fade into obscurity, would be forgotten by history, would leave no mark on the world, except perhaps in the hearts of those closest to him. Thetis, desperate to protect her son, desperate to keep him alive, desperate to preserve him for as long as possible, decided for him. She hid him away on the island of Skyros, disguising him carefully as a girl among the daughters of the local king. In this hiding place, hidden from the call of war, hidden from his own destiny, Achilles would be safe from the fate the fates had foreseen. He would live. But the Greeks needed Achilles. The war could not begin. The massive expedition could not assemble. The ships could not sail without him. Military leaders understood that without the greatest warrior of the age, their chances of victory were substantially diminished. Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, the man renowned throughout Greece for his strategic thinking and his ability to solve seemingly impossible problems, was tasked with finding Achilles and bringing him to Troy. Odysseus traveled to Skyros, disguising himself among merchants, carrying goods to trade with the king's palace. Among his collection of items for trade was a carefully selected array of goods, beautiful silks, delicate jewelry, ornaments that would appeal to young women, items designed to catch the interest and attention of maidens. But hidden among these feminine treasures was a single warrior's weapon. A spear of legendary quality, beautifully crafted, perfectly balanced, the kind of weapon that would call to any true warrior's soul. Odysseus arranged for all these goods to be displayed in the palace courtyard for the king's daughters to examine and select from. And he waited, watching carefully as the young women examined the silks and the jewelry, selecting items with typical feminine interest, picking through the beautiful things with the enthusiasm that such treasures typically generated. But one of the girls, Achilles in his disguise, Achilles pretending to be someone other than who he truly was, immediately gravitated toward the spear. The moment he saw the weapon, the moment his eyes fell upon it, the moment his warrior's instincts recognized something of profound value and significance, he forgot his disguise completely. He picked up the spear, tested its weight in his hands, felt its balance with the appreciation only a true warrior could possess. And his cover was blown in that instant. In that single moment, Achilles' disguise was exposed. The young warrior, recognizing that his hiding place had been discovered, recognizing that he could not continue pretending to be something he fundamentally was not, recognizing that his true nature had been revealed for all to see, made his choice. He chose to go to Troy. But before he departed, before he sailed toward the destiny that would define him, before he left Skyros behind, Achilles visited his mother one final time. Thetis held him and wept, not because she was uncertain of his abilities, not because she doubted his strength, but because she knew with divine certainty, with the knowledge granted to her by the fates themselves, that this was the last time she would hold her son alive, that this embrace would be the final one they would share in this world. "Go," she told him, her voice breaking with emotion. "Go to Troy if you must. But know this, if you stay, if you refuse the call and hide from your destiny, you will live long and peacefully, and your life will be comfortable and secure. But no one will remember you. You will fade into obscurity like a footprint in sand. If you go, if you choose glory, you will achieve fame beyond measure, but you will not return. You will not see home again. You will not grow old. You will not live to see your children or your grandchildren. Choose, my son. Choose between a long life that will be forgotten or a brief life that will be eternal in memory." Achilles, young and burning with the desire to prove himself, to test the limits of his strength against true opponents, to achieve the kind of fame that immortals themselves would recognize, made his choice with the confidence of youth and the passion of someone convinced of his own invulnerability. "I choose glory," he said. And with those words, he accepted his fate. The Greek fleet sailed toward Troy with Achilles aboard, his ships cutting through the wine-dark sea, moving toward the greatest conflict the ancient world would ever witness. As the ships approached the shores of Troy, as the massive expedition prepared to lay siege to the great city, as Achilles stood at the bow of his vessel and felt the weight of destiny settling upon him, he experienced something he had never felt before, the genuine possibility of his own ending. The Trojan War in its opening years belonged entirely to Achilles. From the moment the Greek forces landed on Troy's beaches and the first skirmishes erupted between Greek warriors and Trojan defenders, from the very first day when blood was spilled on Trojan soil, Achilles proved that the legends surrounding him were not exaggeration or poetic embellishment, but simple, undeniable fact. He moved across the battlefield like a force of nature, faster than any opponent could react, stronger than any shield could withstand, more skilled than any warrior had any right to be. Warriors who faced him in combat found themselves overwhelmed not by luck or accident, but by the fundamental reality that they were fighting someone of an entirely different order of being. Some fell to his spear, their bodies collapsing to the ground, with the life gone from their eyes. Others threw down their weapons and surrendered simply because they recognized the absolute impossibility of victory, because they understood that to fight Achilles was to engage in a battle already decided before the first blow was struck. A few warriors died of fear before Achilles even touched them. So overwhelming was his presence, so undeniable his superiority, so terrifying was the knowledge that they were about to face an opponent who could not be defeated. For 9 years, the Trojan War ground on without resolution. Troy's massive walls held firm against every assault. The Greek forces, for all their numbers and their skill, could not breach the city's defenses through conventional siege warfare. But around those walls, on the plains surrounding Troy, Achilles became a legend unto himself. He fought in the front line consistently, leading Greek forces, inspiring warriors through both his skill and his absolute confidence in victory. The Trojans feared him more than they feared any god. His name alone was enough to make warriors hesitate, to make soldiers question whether they should even attempt to fight him, to make mothers and wives weep when they heard that Achilles was preparing for battle. He had become not simply a skilled warrior, but a symbol of Greek might, a living embodiment of the inevitability of Greek victory, a man who seemed to be destiny itself made flesh. And with each victory, with each warrior defeated and left dead on the plains, with each battle won decisively, with each successful skirmish, Achilles' confidence grew. His certainty that he was invincible, that no one could harm him, that his destiny was to dominate this war and achieve eternal glory, became less a belief and more an absolute truth that he lived according to, that he built his entire understanding of the world around. But confidence, especially divine confidence born from genuine invulnerability, can become something dangerous and destructive. Arrogance. The turning point came in the 9th year of the war, when the Greek forces captured a beautiful woman named Briseis from the city of Lyrnessus. She was offered as a prize to Achilles, a recognition of his status as the war's greatest warrior, an acknowledgement of his superiority over all other Greek fighters. He accepted her not merely as a possession to be owned, but as something more. Perhaps the closest thing to actual affection that his warrior's heart could achieve. A brief moment of gentleness in a life defined by violence and glory. A small pocket of warmth in the cold landscape of war. But Briseis was also desired by Agamemnon, the general commanding all Greek forces, the king of Mycenae, and ostensibly the supreme authority over all the Greek armies gathered at Troy. What followed revealed something essential and troubling about Achilles. His pride was even more powerful than his invulnerability, his sense of honor more important than his life itself. Agamemnon, exercising his authority as commander-in-chief, his voice carrying the weight of supreme command, simply took Briseis from Achilles. He claimed her for himself, used his position and his power to overrule even the greatest warrior's claim to his own prize. It was not robbery by ordinary standards. Agamemnon was using his authority, his legal right as supreme commander, to redistribute the spoils of war among the leadership. But to Achilles, it was an unforgivable insult. He had fought harder than any other warrior. He had sacrificed more. He had achieved greater victories. And yet, a lesser warrior, a man who led through political authority rather than individual prowess, was claiming precedence. It was a violation of the natural order. a rejection of Achilles' fundamental assumption that the greatest should command the most, that power should flow to those who possessed it most obviously. Achilles' response was to withdraw from the war entirely. He marched into Agamemnon's tent, his presence commanding and terrifying, his voice trembling with rage. He spoke of the injustice, of the humiliation, of the violation of the natural order. And when Agamemnon refused to acknowledge his wrongdoing, when the commander-in-chief used his position to justify his actions, when Agamemnon's voice rang with the authority of command, Achilles made a decision that would reshape the entire course of the war. He refused to fight. He gathered his men, his elite warriors known as the Myrmidons, and withdrew them from the battle lines. He returned to his ship and announced publicly that he would not participate in the war any longer. He would not risk his life for a cause that did not recognize his worth. He would not shed his blood for a commander who treated him as a subordinate rather than an equal. The Greek forces lost their greatest weapon overnight. Without Achilles leading the front lines, without his unmatched strength turning the tide of battles, without his very presence inspiring confidence and striking fear into Trojan hearts, the Greeks began to lose ground immediately. Trojan warriors, sensing the change in the balance of power, became bolder and more aggressive. They began to push back Greek forces with new confidence. Battles that the Greeks had been winning started to turn dramatically in favor of Troy. Men who would have lived if Achilles had been there to defend them began to die in increasing numbers. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into a month. The Greek forces continued to deteriorate without Achilles. The entire war began to shift, with Troy no longer desperately defending, but actually gaining momentum. The Greeks, who had seemed poised for inevitable victory, now faced the very real possibility of defeat. And Achilles, sitting by his ships, watching the Greek forces struggle without him, watching men die who might have lived if he had chosen differently, felt the crushing weight of something he had never truly experienced before. The knowledge that his absence had consequences, that people died because he was not there to defend them, that his pride, his refusal to fight over an insult, had real costs measured in human lives and in suffering. It was Patroclus who finally reached him. Achilles' closest companion, his dearest friend, a warrior of considerable skill though not matching Achilles' superhuman abilities, a man who loved Achilles with a depth of affection that transcended ordinary friendship. Patroclus came to Achilles and begged him to return to the fight, to stop punishing the entire Greek army for his grievance with Agamemnon, to recognize that his personal honor was less important than the lives of thousands of soldiers. But Achilles, still too angry, still too wounded in his pride, still too convinced that his dignity mattered more than anything else, refused. He was still too insulted, still too certain that justice had not been served, still too focused on his grievance. So Patroclus made a desperate choice that would change everything. He asked Achilles' permission to wear his armor, Achilles' famous golden armor, crafted by Hephaestus himself, so distinctive and so recognizable that everyone who saw it would believe Achilles had returned to the fight. If Patroclus wore the armor, if he led Achilles' Myrmidons back into battle, perhaps the Greeks could hold the line, could buy time for Achilles to recover from his anger and return to the fighting. Achilles, still wounded in his pride but moved by Patroclus' desperation, moved by his friend's willingness to put himself in danger, agreed to this compromise. He gave Patroclus his armor. He allowed his dearest friend to wear the golden plates that had protected him in countless battles. And he let Patroclus lead his warriors back into the fight. For a brief time, it worked brilliantly. The sight of Achilles' golden armor moving across the battlefield, leading the Myrmidons forward with purpose and determination, inspired hope in the Greek forces that had been losing faith. Trojan warriors, seeing what they believed was Achilles returning to the fight, panicked. The tide of battle shifted. Greek forces began to press forward, began to regain ground they had lost. But Patroclus, wearing Achilles' armor, was not Achilles. He was skilled and brave and fought with courage that exceeded what most warriors could muster. But he was not invincible. He could be harmed. He could be killed. And his mortal limitations meant that he could be defeated. Facing him on the battlefield was Hector, the greatest Trojan warrior, a man of incredible skill and strength, who had proven himself equal to any Greek warrior except Achilles. Hector saw through the deception. He recognized that the warrior in golden armor was not Achilles, no matter what the armor suggested. They fought, Patroclus and Hector, with all the skill and fury that two of the ancient world's greatest warriors could muster. Steel clashed against steel. Spears thrust and were parried. Shields took the impact of devastating blows. For what seemed like hours, they battled on equal terms, and in the end, Hector's spear found its mark. Patroclus fell, dying on the battlefield far from home, his body still clothed in Achilles' armor, bleeding into the dust of Troy. When Achilles learned of Patroclus's death, when runners brought him the news, when he understood that his dearest friend, the person closest to him in his entire existence, had been killed while wearing his armor, while fighting in his place, while dying because of his pride and his refusal to fight, something in him shattered completely. The rage that had been directed at Agamemnon, the pride that had kept him from the battlefield, all of it was consumed by a grief so profound and so overwhelming that it transformed him completely. Achilles understood in that moment, with a clarity that transcended all his earlier certainty, what true loss felt like. He understood that there were things worth more than pride, that there were consequences to refusing to fight, that his absence had not cost abstract Greek lives, but the specific, irreplaceable life of the person he loved most. Achilles' grief transformed into something even more powerful than his earlier rage, a desire for vengeance so consuming that it burned away everything else, a need to kill so overwhelming that it became his entire reason for existing. He returned to battle not out of duty or obligation, not because Agamemnon apologized or because the situation changed, but because he needed to find Hector and make him pay for taking Patroclus from him. He needed to transform his grief into violence, his sorrow into slaughter, his heartbreak into destruction. When Achilles returned to the battlefield, when he donned new armor that Hephaestus himself crafted for him as the war god's gift, when he entered the Trojan lines with a fury that seemed almost supernatural in its intensity, the effect was absolute and devastating. Warriors fell before him like wheat before a scythe. He cut through Trojan forces with such overwhelming ferocity that they scattered, retreating in panic. The entire Trojan army began to buckle under his onslaught. His spear seemed to find targets by its own will. His strength seemed limitless. His speed appeared to defy the laws of nature itself. Trojan warriors died by the hundreds. They died so quickly that sometimes Achilles' spear passed through one body and struck another before falling to the ground. The river Xanthus, which flowed through the plain of Troy, became so choked with Trojan bodies that the river itself seemed to personify, to become aware, to protest against the magnitude of death being deposited into its waters. And through this slaughter, through this absolute dominance, through this decimation of everything that stood before him, Achilles searched for one man, Hector. He called for Hector to face him, his voice carrying across the battlefield with terrible clarity, so loud and terrible that it caused warriors to freeze in their tracks. He hunted through the Trojan forces, looking for his enemy, driven by a grief-born fury that exceeded even his earlier arrogance. And finally, after days of searching and fighting, Hector answered the call. They met outside Troy's walls, the greatest Greek warrior and the greatest Trojan warrior, two men who embodied everything their respective sides represented. Two warriors who had come to define the entire war through their individual excellence. They stood facing each other on the plain of Troy, and even the other soldiers seemed to recognize the significance of this moment. Fighting stopped. Warriors stepped back. The universe seemed to hold its breath as these two legends prepared to determine the fate of the war through single combat. They fought with the grim determination of two warriors who understood that this combat would determine not just their own fates, but perhaps the fate of the entire Trojan War. They moved with the precision of artists, with the fury of demons, with the grace of dancers choreographing a deadly ballet. Achilles was faster. He was stronger. He was driven by a grief that would not allow him to stop, a vengeance that would not permit him to fail. He moved with the absolute confidence of someone who had never truly been challenged, who had never encountered an opponent who could genuinely threaten him. And when Achilles' spear finally struck true, when it pierced through Hector's defenses, when it found its mark in the greatest Trojan warrior's flesh, when Hector fell dead on the plain of Troy, Achilles achieved something he had sought his entire time at war. Undeniable, absolute, unmistakable victory. But the victory felt hollow, because Patroclus was still dead. Achieving vengeance had not brought his friend back. Killing Hector had not restored what Achilles had lost. The grief remained, burning inside him like an eternal flame, made only sharper by the fact that he had achieved perfect victory without being able to share it with the person who mattered most. Achilles' rage did not end with Hector's death. If anything, it intensified. He dragged Hector's body behind his chariot, desecrating the corpse, refusing to allow the Trojans to bury their greatest warrior. Driven by a fury that had evolved beyond rational response into something almost demonic, into pure expression of anguish masked as vengeance. For days, Achilles repeated this ritual, dragging Hector's body around Troy's walls, humiliating the corpse, refusing all attempts at negotiation or ransom, driven by grief that had nowhere else to express itself. He was consumed by his anguish, by his rage, by the need to express through violence what he could not express through words. It was Priam, Hector's father, the king of Troy, an old man bent with age and sorrow, who finally reached him. The ancient king, driven by love for his son, by the human need to give his child a proper burial, made his way to Achilles' tent in the middle of the night. He was unarmed. He was unguarded. He was vulnerable in a way that would have made him an easy target for someone motivated by pure vengeance. But instead of attacking, Priam knelt before Achilles. He took the hand of the man who had killed his son, the hand still stained with his child's blood, and he spoke about fatherhood, about love, about the universality of grief. You know what it is to lose those you love, Priam said, his voice breaking with emotion. I see your grief burning in you like fire. You killed my son, and my grief burns too. But we are both men who have loved and lost. We both understand what it means to have your heart torn from your chest. We are not so different, you and I. We are both fathers, both men who have watched those we love be taken from us. For the first time since Patroclus' death, Achilles wept. Not the rage tears of fury and anger, but the deep, chest-shaking sobs of genuine sorrow, of authentic grief, of profound human anguish. He understood that his vengeance had not healed him, that his rage had not restored what he had lost, that no amount of violence could bring back the person he loved. He allowed Priam to take Hector's body. He permitted the Trojans to bury their hero with honors. And in that act of mercy, in that final choice to let go of his rage and his vengeance, Achilles began to understand something that his entire life had been leading toward. Shortly after, as Achilles stood on the battlefield in the aftermath of his greatest triumph, as he watched the sun setting over Troy and reflected on the cost of his victory, an arrow found him. It came from the bow of Paris, Hector's brother, the man whose abduction of Helen had started the entire war. The arrow was guided by Apollo himself, god of prophecy and truth, who had decided that Achilles' time in the world had come to its end, and the arrow struck him in the one place where he was vulnerable, the one spot where Thetis's hand had gripped him as she dipped him in the river Styx, the one place where the sacred waters had not touched, where the protection had not reached. It struck him in the heel. The pain was unlike anything Achilles had ever experienced. Not because he was unused to pain, a lifetime of combat had familiarized him with wounds and injuries, but because this pain meant something final, something irreversible, something that could not be overcome through strength or will or determination. This pain meant the end. Achilles fell to the ground, his invincibility shattered by a single arrow, fired by a warrior he had not even considered worth fighting. All his strength, all his training, all his divine protection, all the rituals his mother had performed to make him nearly invincible, meant nothing against the simple fact that he had been struck in the one place where he could be harmed. He lay dying on the plains of Troy, surrounded by warriors, watched by Greeks and Trojans alike. The greatest warrior who had ever lived reduced to a dying man, bleeding out in the dust, his legendary strength unable to prevent the inevitable. As death approached, as Achilles felt his consciousness beginning to fade, as the world started to grow dim around him, something unexpected happened. The god Poseidon, moved by the death of the greatest warrior he had ever witnessed, reached down and carried Achilles' spirit away from the battlefield. Rather than allowing the hero to fade into complete oblivion, rather than permitting the greatest warrior of the age to simply cease to exist and be forgotten, Poseidon transported Achilles to the Isles of the Blessed, the paradise reserved for the greatest heroes and the most honored dead, the eternal home where legendary warriors could finally rest. There, in the eternal twilight of the afterlife, in a realm where time had no meaning and suffering had no place, Achilles was reunited with Patroclus. The two friends, separated by death, were brought together again in a place beyond mortal suffering, beyond the reach of war and grief and the complicated dynamics of the mortal world. In the Isles of the Blessed, Achilles finally found what he had been searching for his entire life: peace, not through victory or dominance, but through genuine connection, through the presence of the person he loved most. They walked together through meadows of eternal flowers. They sat by rivers that reflected starlight. They spoke of everything they had endured, everything they had sacrificed, everything they had lost. And in that communion, in that reunion, after years of separation, Achilles understood that true glory was not measured in battles won or enemies defeated, but in the depth of connection with those we truly care about. But Achilles' death did not end the Trojan War. Troy's walls eventually fell to the Greeks through the wooden horse. The same strategy that Odysseus would orchestrate years before this moment in time. The same clever deception that turned the tide of an unwinnable war. The city burned. The Trojans were slaughtered or enslaved. The Greeks achieved their victory, the victory they had sacrificed 10 years to obtain. But it was a victory that came at enormous cost. Thousands of warriors had died. The war had lasted 10 years, consuming an entire generation of the greatest warriors Greece had ever produced. The survivors returned to their homes, changed by what they had witnessed, carrying psychological and physical wounds that they would never fully recover from. And Achilles' death had proven something that few Greeks had wanted to believe, something that challenged the fundamental assumptions of every warrior who had sailed to Troy, that even the greatest among them could fall, that invulnerability was not absolute, that the promised glory of war often came wrapped in tragedy and loss. In the centuries after his death, Achilles' story became legend. Poets sang of his exploits, of his unmatched strength, of his devastating victories, of his tragic fall. Young warriors were inspired by his deeds and warned by his fate. Mothers spoke his name as both an aspiration and a cautionary tale, encouraging their sons to strive for greatness while warning them of the price such greatness demanded. But what is often lost in the telling of Achilles' story is perhaps the most important part. Not his invulnerability or his strength or his devastating victories, but the profound transformation he underwent through grief and loss, through the experience of genuine connection, through the realization that true power lay not in dominance, but in compassion. Achilles began his life as the ultimate expression of divine superiority. A being so removed from ordinary humanity through his power and his potential that he seemed almost untouchable, almost beyond the reach of normal human emotion or limitation. He was created to be perfect, to be invincible, to be the apotheosis of what a warrior could achieve. But the vulnerability in his heel was not simply a physical weakness. It was a metaphor, a symbol, a profound truth about the nature of existence itself. That true invulnerability is impossible, that complete protection from harm is not granted to any being, that even those who appear most powerful carry within them the capacity to be wounded, to be broken, to be transformed. And through Patroclus's death, through the experience of grief that no amount of strength could defend against, through the confrontation with King Priam that forced him to recognize the common humanity shared by both victor and vanquished, through the realization that his enemy was also a father grieving the loss of his son, Achilles learned what his mother could never teach him and what his divine favor could never provide. The capacity to grow beyond himself, to transcend his own pride, to connect with others in genuine compassion and authentic empathy. His final act of mercy, allowing Priam to retrieve Hector's body, permitting the enemy king to bury his son with honors, choosing empathy over vengeance, was perhaps his truest victory. Not the defeat of Hector or the slaughter of Trojan warriors, but the moment when he chose compassion over rage, when he chose humanity over divine supremacy, when he chose to acknowledge the grief of an old man and allow him the dignity of burying his son. In that single choice, Achilles became something more than a warrior of unmatched power. He became a symbol of the possibility of redemption, of the capacity for growth that exists even in those seemingly hardened by violence, of the transformative power of genuine connection and shared sorrow. Achilles' heel, the vulnerable spot that ultimately killed him, was never meant to be hidden or denied or ashamed of. It was meant to teach him, and through him, to teach all of humanity, that vulnerability is not weakness, that the greatest strength lies not in invulnerability, but in the courage to remain open to connection despite the risk of pain. That glory achieved through domination is hollow compared to honor earned through compassion and understanding. His entire life, from birth to death, was a progression from one understanding to another. He began believing that invulnerability was the highest good, that strength was the ultimate value, that glory could be achieved through force and demonstrated superiority. But through loss, through grief, through the confrontation with his own limitations, through the encounter with an enemy's father who showed him the universality of human suffering, he learned that the most valuable things in existence, love, friendship, compassion, genuine human connection, are precisely the things that make us vulnerable. When the arrow struck his heel, when the invincible warrior fell, when mortality finally claimed what immortal power had protected, Achilles was not primarily ending. He was finally, fully becoming what he was meant to be all along, a complete human being, someone who understood both his power and his limitations, someone who could wield strength with compassion, someone who could achieve victory and still choose mercy. He became a man who had experienced everything: triumph and defeat, strength and vulnerability, rage and compassion, the burning pride of youth and the hard-won wisdom of accepting limitation. He became a hero whose power lay not simply in what he could destroy, but in what he had learned about himself and about the nature of true strength. And in the Isles of the Blessed, reunited with Patroclus, finally at peace, finally home in the place where he truly belonged, Achilles understood the greatest truth of all, that the journey toward becoming fully human was not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be celebrated, a transformation to be honored, a path to be walked with pride. His heel had not been a flaw to be ashamed of. It had been a gift, a reminder that even the greatest among us carry within us the capacity to be wounded, to be broken, to be transformed. And it is precisely in those moments of vulnerability, precisely in those times when our defenses fall away, precisely in those moments of deep connection with others, that we have the opportunity to become something greater than we were before. Achilles' legend would inspire warriors for millennia to come. Young men would train, hoping to match his strength. Poets would craft their greatest works around his story. Mothers would speak his name as both an ideal and a warning. But the true gift Achilles left to the world was not the memory of his victories, was not the impressive catalogue of warriors he defeated, was not the fear his name inspired in his enemies. The true gift Achilles left to the world was the memory of his choice to embrace his humanity in the face of divine power, to accept grief as the price of love, to recognize that true immortality lay not in unmatched strength, but in the transformation of heart that connection with others can provide. It was the realization that the heel that killed him was also the thing that made him finally, completely, irreplaceably human. That the vulnerability that ended his life was also the thing that gave his life meaning. He was the greatest warrior who ever lived. But his greatest achievement was not in what he conquered, but in what he learned to cherish. Not in his invincibility, but in his capacity to feel, to grieve, to grow, to finally understand that the heel that carried him across battlefields was also the thing that connected him to all of humanity, that his mortality was not a limitation, but a gift, that his brief, brilliant life meant infinitely more than an eternity of domination could have. And that, perhaps, is the truest glory of all, not the endless accumulation of victories, not the eternal reputation unblemished by loss, not the invulnerability that keeps us separated from genuine human experience, but the capacity to love deeply, to grieve authentically, to grow continuously, to connect genuinely with those around us, and to understand that it is precisely our limitations that give our existence meaning and our connections value. Achilles' story teaches us that true heroism lies not in what we overcome, but in what we allow to overcome us. Not in our invulnerability, but in our willingness to be vulnerable. Not in our power to destroy, but in our capacity to understand, to forgive, to connect, and to love.